So yeah, we're at 2 o'clock. I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you back from the Christmas break and also to this module. So this is now the fourth year that this module has run, and I'm pretty chuffed at the response that it's gotten. Certainly so far, lots of keen runners and people interested in biomechanics, evolutionary biology and physiology and technology, I guess. So that's really nice. So this is an exciting space. Oops. This is a sort of a really interesting space. Sports science research is advancing really quickly over the last decade or so. It's moved on quite a bit, and this module captures some of that, I hope. Now, the module is fully booked. I've had to limit it to 800 students because it comes with a fair amount of admin. So there are a number of students waiting in the wings if spots open up. So if you think, based on what I talked about today and what you see on Brightspace, that this module may not be for you, I'd encourage you to swap soon and open up that spot for someone who wants it, for someone who will engage with the learning material and make the most of the opportunity. But considering that you're here now, today on a Friday afternoon, I imagine that you're one of the motivated ones. Also, if anything comes up, if anything is unclear, feel free to interrupt me and just ask a question, or if there's any issues around the sound or something like that, just let me know. Now, the reason I'm kind of pleased at the response among the student community that this module has had is because this module actually draws on a bunch of research that was done over the last 10 years or so out of the School of Physiotherapy and Sports Science and in the Insight Centre for Data Analytics, which is based in UCD as well. Not just my research, but loads of people's research. So over the next 12 weeks, we'll be doing a deep dive into not only our own research, but also some really interesting research from the fields of, like I said, evolutionary biology, from physiology, from biomechanics, sports science, physiotherapy, nutrition, and digital health. The content is divided out over 10 learning units, which will be delivered over the course of the next 12 weeks. Now, a little embarrassingly, as you'll see, or as you've already seen, I fancy myself as a little bit of a YouTuber. So I've prepared a video lecture for each of these topics that you see on screen, which covers pretty much all or around 90% of the theoretical material that is examinable. So to get a good grade in this module, you'll have to watch these videos. Most likely more than once. I hope you don't get too sick of the sight of me. But the advantage of this approach is flexibility. You can watch the video lectures at any point throughout a given week, and once they're released, they'll be available for the rest of the semester. Now, the reason I've done it this way is because despite any lecturer's best effort, most of the time in a 1 or a 2 hour lecture is spent on ums and ahs, setting up AV material and generally explaining a topic in a less concise way than can be achieved with a script and a bit of effort on diagrams and animations. There's easily the same amount of material covered in each 15-minute lecture or 15-minute video that will be released to you each week as would be covered in a 2 hour lecture. The information is just being streamlined. This is the first module I've conducted entirely online, and generally students have reported liking this approach, but I'd still welcome any feedback. I've incorporated the feedback I've gotten from previous years in the current version of the module. You're actually getting an entirely new batch of video lectures that I've recorded in the last couple of weeks based on the feedback I've gotten. So the point is, feedback is really important to me. If you have any feedback, feel free to send it on. And also there'll be an opportunity at the end of the semester. But having said that, I still want to have some face-to-face teaching with you. Some way for us to maybe engage in a discussion about the learning material presented in the videos and to expand on the topics they cover. So one of the ways we'll be doing that is by having one of these live lectures every 3 weeks or so. So on week 1, which is today, obviously, week 4, week 7, and week 10. And probably week 13, where we'll discuss arrangements for the final exam. Now, during these live lectures, I'll try to gauge your knowledge with quizzes or try to initiate some extracurricular activities. Potentially, we did a few of these in previous years, which were really nice. Some sort of research studies. Entirely voluntary, you don't have to do them. But the idea is that the more you sort of give in terms of engagement to this module, the more you get out of it. Now, the exams will be, oh, yeah. So let me just have a look. I think I've lost, am I on the wrong slide here? Hold on. So just with regards to the exams will be online, one at the end of week 6 and another on the 1st of May. So the 2 dates that you need to have in your diary are the 6th of March and then the 1st of May. They're both Fridays and they're both at 5:30. So they're kind of during the revision weeks and hopefully outside of your lab timetables or whatever else. Now, the questions are a mix of MCQs, which will be negatively marked, and short answer questions. Like I said in that intro video I would release this week, this is not a guaranteed A module. So if that's your only reason you're here, there are easier modules to take. But if you're interested in this subject matter and you're willing to study, then an A is certainly achievable. Each of these exams will be worth 40% of your overall grade, with the remaining 20% going for the completion of the online learning units. So basically, you'll get 20% in this module just by watching the video lectures and by completing the retrieval practice associated with it. Your score in that research practice or that retrieval practice won't contribute to your overall grade. Let me just put this back up on screen just a second. This is where I wanted my Brightspace. So you'll basically get 1% for completing the quiz and watching the video. Now, clicking into a video and getting that completion tick by itself doesn't count. In fact, don't pay attention to the completion tick at all. It doesn't work sometimes, so don't worry about it. But in the background, Brightspace monitors whether you've sort of engaged with learning material or not, and that's what I'll be using. I've created a bit of a program that parses your engagement data on Brightspace to check whether you've watched the video or not. Now remember, and trust me, this is not something that if you watch the video, you get it. It's never been an issue in the past. Like I said, most of your examinable material is in these videos, so I'd recommend that you watch them more than once if you want a good grade. But just to get that 1% for each time you watch a video, you just have to watch it for a few minutes. It doesn't have to be from the very first second to the very last. It's just a few minutes of it. So yeah, back in terms of the timeline, you'll get 20% of your overall grade for completing everything in blue. And those weekly retrieval practice exercises, the questions used in those are from the same question bank of about 500 roughly that I'll be using for the mid-semester and end of semester exams. So there's a chance they could come up again. So that's the marking system. But there is one thing I want to highlight, and I kind of accidentally skipped ahead a second ago. So when it comes to the sort of philosophy of this module, actually, before I get into that, from what I've read on the various online forums, like things like the UCD Reddit page or review sites like Elective HQ, most people just want an easy grade out of their electives. And I've touched on this a couple of times already. I haven't designed this module to be easy. Yes, I'm trying to be flexible by making it online. And yes, I've tried to minimize the amount of redundant time commitment by spending a lot of effort scripting and editing the content, but the core theory is actually quite complex. My hope, and this is down to the philosophy of the module, is that you learn all of the science around running. No, sorry, not that you learn all of the science around running, but rather how to show, I want to show you how to apply scientific research in practice. Running and the science of human endurance, it's just a vessel for this deeper, more core message. How do you reconcile what an expert says with empirical evidence? How do you apply what's been found in a research paper and apply that to understand the world better or to change practice in some way? So how do you parse through all the misinformation that we are bombarded with online every day, and it's particularly topical these last few years? That's kind of what the core philosophy of this module is about. it's that they're the underlying themes. So I took this screenshot from Reddit a couple of years back. So it says 3 days ago there, so it's actually probably about 3 years ago. This module has never come up on this forum as a recommendation for an easy module. There are easier modules out there. There are easier ways to get an A with minimal workload, and it's not too late to swap if that's all you want. Anyway, I've said enough on that. So a bit of housekeeping. This is the structure of your module on Brightspace. So the module is essentially comprised of recorded lectures and live lectures. Each week, a new recorded lecture will be released to you, each of which will have an accompanying retrieval practice. I've already mentioned you get 20% over the course of the entire module for watching these videos and doing those retrieval practice exercises. Then at the end of each week, I used to release a shorter, more concise, a sort of an edited version of the same video just to help you with your revision, but that might skip over the longer explanations and things like that. But one of the pieces of feedback that students gave me is that they were just like, just give us one video lecture and we'll figure out what we need to focus on. So of the video lectures that I have updated, I think I've done the first 4 now. These are all new. I've taken away the shorter versions of these videos, but they might still be present in later lectures. They are going to be removed, though, in the near future. So ultimately, there is only really one video that you need to pay attention to, the long form version. When I say long, none of them are over 20 minutes. So here you can see the live lectures. They're all there, and that's all the core module content. Now, one new addition, which I brought in last year as a sort of a pilot, and now it's sort of fully fledged, is our own module GPT. So to create this, I've essentially uploaded all the module content, the lecture notes, the transcripts from the live lectures, all the scientific papers I cite in both of these, the schedule, and packaged it with some instructions so that, for example, it can tell you when the exam is, or it can create notes for you. It can help you to study a topic you're having trouble with, and lots of other things. So I'd be keen to know how it works. The feedback last year was very helpful, but for the most part, students loved it. And there's a feedback form on Brightspace as well. Regarding the class discussions, I'd encourage you to use the discussion forums on Brightspace. As I mentioned, there are over 800 people in this class, so I'll be honest, there's no way we're going to be able to respond to every email query. That's one of the reasons I created the module GPT, to answer simpler questions around scheduling and things like that. So if you have any questions about exams or schedules, whether the class will be recorded or anything that isn't a personal matter, like if you need to apply for extenuating circumstances, for that you should just email born2run, all one word, at ucd.ie. For anything other than those sorts of things, use the module GPT or put it in the discussion board on Brightspace and I'll answer it there. If you're entitled to extra time during your exam, email born2run at ucd.ie. General point, not just for this module, but for all modules in UCD, if you're entitled to extra time or something like that, it's your responsibility to reach out to the module coordinator to sort it out. So just a heads up on that. It isn't done automatically for you. The last thing I would say is that in terms of feedback, you can also comment anonymously on YouTube. If you have any questions or comments about the comment, I can't imagine you'll be any crueler than the wider internet, so don't hold back. So with that sort of housekeeping done, before I get started with this week's topic, does anyone have any questions or comments? Go for it. Now, bear in mind, this is recorded. If I just want to make sure you're happy that this will go out there. Yeah, that's fine. Great. Yeah. Zero for blanks. Yep. Yeah. Great. And thanks. That's a good question. That's probably something I should clarify, and we'll make sure to do that next time around next year in this lecture. Brilliant. Okay. So the first 3 topics that are covered in the pre-recorded lectures from weeks 1 to 3 are all to do with our anatomy and our physiology. and how they have evolved to make us good long distance runners. So I assume that by now you've watched the first video lecture, which is all about the ways in which we've evolved to walk and run in that order. And I assume you've also completed the 3-item retrieval practice that accompanies it. So I'll remind you that those questions that I use in those quizzes could come up in the final exam, and you only have access to the quizzes for 1 week once they're released. So just a note. In any case, if you've watched those lectures, done the quiz, you'll understand that there's something to be gained from comparing ape and human anatomy, because structure dictates function. The example here shows how the ape has to tip from side to side to maintain balance. That tipping costs energy, and anything that costs energy is problematic from an evolutionary standpoint. You know, we're not used to that concept in this calorie-rich world, but 100,000 years ago, it was a big driver of evolution. So when it comes to our evolutionary story, there were essentially 5 major transformations that led to where we are today. The first major transformation was that we stood upright and started walking. Why? It meant we could go farther more efficiently, and that was really important for us so that we could get more food. You see, because of climate change, the forests around us began to shrink. So the fruits that were the staple of our diet, and when I say we, this is our boreal ancestors. Homo sapiens hadn't yet emerged when I say we. So those staple fruits became less abundant. We therefore had to climb down from our trees, which themselves were becoming more spread out, and walk to gather roots, tubers, and other plants for energy. Now, then over the course of several millennia, we did something that would have a profound knock-on effect to our ability to source energy. We started hunting other animals. So having the option to eat either plants or animals with all of their energy-rich fatty tissue freed up energy for our brains to grow. And around this time, we discovered fire. And fire led to us discovering cooking. And cooking unlocks the calories from food by making it easier to digest and easier to absorb. And then bigger brains ultimately led to language, which early on would have helped with teamwork, with bringing down large game, and then culture and cooperation would have followed. But the thing I focused on in lectures 1 to 3 are the anatomical and physiological predicates of this. So our ability to hunt and gather well. A lot of what we know about what our ancestors did in prehistoric times, let's say about 50,000 years ago, we've learned by observing modern hunter-gatherer societies. So here's some footage from an old BBC documentary which captures a group of hunter-gatherers as they perform what is now called persistence hunting. It looks fine on my screen. I imagine via Zoom it might be the frame rate might be very low, but it's available on YouTube. It goes on for around 5 minutes, so we won't get to see all of it anyway. But it's worth a watch, and it's really interesting. It shows, and I tried to depict this in the video lecture, a group of Hadza hunters tracking an antelope across the savannah at the hottest part of the day. So not to be reductive, but if there was a single human behavior, a sort of a first domino in the cascade of events that led to the success of Homo sapiens over all other species of Homo, it was this. So Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo florensis, all of those, the thing that separated us from them, if it had to be one thing, and it was actually, it is reductive, but if it had to be one thing, it would be persistence hunting. Persistence hunting opened up the world to us. Firstly, as a way to get calories, but then as a way to get resources like bone and fur. And it also translated into more advanced forms of hunting. So as we spread across the world into cooler climates, we had by then figured out how to hunt prey without having to rely on heat and persistence. So when we spread into Europe, for example. So by that time, we had cooperation, we had strategy, we had culture, we set traps, we had spears and other rudimentary weapons, but weapons. All of these things wouldn't have been possible without that third major transformation, which, like I said, took place in West Africa, or potentially even, there's a new evidence emerging that says that it was even further back in Northern Africa. But anyway, that in a nutshell is the gist of lecture 1. In lecture 2, which will be released on Monday, that's going to be all about the biomechanics of running, a little bit more technical. So how form leads to function when it comes to moving a body from one place to another as safely as possible and efficiently as possible. I say efficiently because that's really, really important. And then lecture 3 is all about the physiology systems underlying that function. How does your body create and store the energy it needs to be active? Now, the module takes a little bit of a turn at week 4. At that point, we'll start to go beyond the human body as a machine idea, and the idea that performance is solely determined by anatomy and physiology. And we'll start to acknowledge the role of the brain and how it perceives fatigue and how that is a core aspect of performance. And it's at that point we'll have our next live lecture. So I won't be seeing you until then. Now, up until this point in the module, up to lecture 4, we'll be talking about anatomy, biomechanics, physiology, as if performance is something that we can point to in the body. So muscles, tendons, lungs, energy systems. And all of that does matter. But before we proceed to the middle chunk of lectures in weeks 5 through 7, which are all about injury, training, and athletic performance, there's something really important I want to clarify, because it's going to shape how you interpret everything else in this module, how you interpret that sort of research in the real world, as I mentioned at the opening. There's a very common assumption that creeps in whenever we talk about the evolution, our evolution and endurance running. We tend to talk as if evolution optimized the human body for running, as if natural selection was trying to build the perfect endurance athlete. But that's not how it works. We are really good at endurance running in very hot weather, but evolution doesn't optimize it. It satisfies. So natural selection doesn't care about performance in the way that we think about it in a sporting context. It doesn't care about personal bests, about marathon times, or finishing strong. It cares about one thing only: not dying before reproduction. That's it. Okay. So when we tell the story of persistence hunting, of how our ancestors were running prey to exhaustion in the heat, we're not talking about speed or efficiency in the modern sporting sense. We're talking about being good enough to keep moving, good enough to regulate heat, and good enough to recover and do it again the next day, over and over, without getting injured, being able to source food every day, not doing it really well one day in a month. So if a trait made someone 5% faster, and I'm using a cheetah example here, but it applies to humans too. So if a trait made a cheetah or a human 5% faster, but it doubled their risk of injury, evolution wouldn't select for it, because an injured hunter doesn't pass on their genes. The upshot is that the human body wasn't built for maximal performance. Now, I know we're not covering bodybuilding at all in this module, but visually, this kind of encapsulates that. It's impressive, but it's not what we've evolved to be. And it certainly wouldn't have been sustainable in our hunter-gatherer days. The point I'm trying to get at here is that our body was built for robustness under uncertainty, for tolerating variation, for surviving imperfect conditions with imperfect information. And that distinction matters, because modern endurance sport, particularly marathon running, is doing something very, very different. The marathon it's a cultural invention. There's Pheidippides there. I don't know if you know the story of the marathon. You don't need to know it, but it's just a historical accident that later became institutionalized and standardized and eventually commercialized. But it just so happens to sit right at the edge of what our evolved systems can tolerate. So it pushes fuel availability, heat regulation, connective tissue durability, and psychological tolerance all at once, not occasionally, but repeatedly. And because of that, the marathon becomes a little bit of a stress test of the human organism as a whole, and a great way to learn about how the body works, which is why I go on to use it as a lens to learn about how and why we run later in the module. I wouldn't want you to get too caught up with the marathon specifically. It's just a case study. It's just a lens that I use for this, for the core research. So we've talked about how our bodies have evolved to run, but that doesn't mean we're optimized to run the 26 miles of the marathon as quickly as possible. So many discussions about running start with the phrase, humans are meant to, and they kind of fall apart at that point. An evolutionary explanation should not be used to justify a modern performance claim it was never designed to support. So I've tried to explicitly avoid this in the module, and I'm flagging it here now. Yes, our anatomy and physiology are remarkable. They're the reason endurance running is even possible in the first place. But modern endurance sport isn't asking ancient systems to do. It is asking ancient systems to do very modern things. And most of the interesting science in this module lives in that gap between what evolution gave us and what we now ask of it. So if evolution didn't design us to run marathons, it's worth asking a very simple question. Why this distance? Why is it such a prominent cultural artifact? Why 26.2 miles? Why not 20? Why not 100? Why does this particular length of time and effort feel so uniquely difficult and compelling? The answer isn't that the marathon is natural. It isn't. And it isn't that it represents some kind of biological optimum. It doesn't. The marathon matters because it sits kind of on the edge of what humans can repeatedly do without breaking. And that's why it's a nice lens for us. So at this distance, almost every system we'll talk about becomes relevant at the same time. Fuel availability starts to matter. Heat dissipation becomes a problem. Connective tissue, fatigue accumulates. Neuromuscular coordination degrades. And probably most importantly, your perception of effort, that sort of mental fatigue, begins to shift in ways that don't map neatly onto what's happening in your muscles. So below this distance, 800 meters, 1K, 5K, that sort of thing, you can often get away with inefficiencies. Above it, small errors compound very quickly. And that's what makes the marathon such a useful lens, as I say, for studying human performance. It exposes limits, not just physiological ones, but organizational ones. How well the body coordinates its systems under sustained stress. And this is why the marathon keeps reappearing throughout this module. It's kind of a long-winded way for me to say that. So when we talk about biomechanics, we'll ask how small changes in movement affect energy cost over long durations. When we talk about physiology, we'll look at how energy is produced, stored, and ultimately depleted. And when we talk about training, we'll ask how much stress the body can adapt to before it stops adapting. We'll also be talking about footwear and wearables in weeks 6 and 8. We'll ask whether technology is helping us manage these limits or simply sort of push them further or harder. So in other words, the marathon will become our case study, not because it's special in an evolutionary sense, but because it's revealing. It shows us where our ancient systems start to sort of creak under modern demands. And for most people, the interesting part isn't whether you can complete a marathon, it's what happens somewhere along the way. So an effort suddenly feels disproportionate when pace drops despite your best intentions and when the body says no before the legs have completely failed. Anyone who's done a marathon is likely to experience that. It's that moment, the one that runners would describe as hitting the wall. It's not just about running out of fuel, it's about how the brain integrates information from the body and makes decisions under uncertainty. So all of this is covered in week 4. That's where the module is sort of ultimately headed. Week 4 sets us off on that path. So as you watch the video lectures over the next few weeks, and as we come back together for the live sessions, I'd like to finish by encouraging you to think of the marathon not as a race, but I guess as a question. What are the limits of human endurance, and who or what determines where those limits are? And that's where we'll pick things up the next time.